The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. A luxury first-class flight, a journey for the elite, business executives, celebrities, and the wealthy filled the space. Every detail in this section of the plane was tailored for comfort, from the plush leather seats to the champagne being served before takeoff. The flight attendants moved with practiced elegance, but among them was one who stood out, not for her charm, but for her attitude. She had been in this job long enough to believe she could judge passengers at a glance. To her, first class was for the powerful, and she only respected those who looked important. A man, well-dressed but unassuming, entered the cabin. His demeanor was calm, almost too ordinary compared to the showy confidence of the other passengers. He took his seat quietly, adjusting his wristwatch as he waited. The arrogant flight attendant passed by, barely acknowledging him. Instead, she focused on a group of high-profile businessmen, laughing at their jokes, making sure they felt special. When she finally turned toward the man, it was with a noticeable difference in attitude. "Excuse me," he said politely, looking up at her. "May I have a glass of water?" Her lips curled into a tight, dismissive smile. "Sir, we serve premium drinks in first class," she said, her tone sharp. "Perhaps economy would be better suited for your request?" A few passengers nearby glanced in their direction. Some looked uncomfortable, while others pretended not to hear. The man held her gaze for a second. His face didn't change. No anger, no embarrassment. Just a quiet understanding. "I see," he said simply, then leaned back in his seat. The flight attendant smirked and walked away, not even bothering to check if he wanted anything else. To her, he was just another passenger who didn't deserve attention. But as she continued serving the other guests, she failed to notice something. Several of her colleagues had suddenly gone quiet. A few exchanged glances, and one of them whispered something under her breath. Something wasn't right. The air in the cabin shifted. And the flight attendant had no idea that she had just made a terrible mistake. The flight attendant walked away, still wearing the same smug expression. She had put him in his place, or so she thought. She moved back to the group of businessmen, laughing at their jokes, refilling their glasses with expensive wine, completely ignoring the man she had just insulted. But the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had changed. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A man sitting across the aisle discreetly checked his phone, his eyes widening slightly before he quickly put it away. Another traveler, an older gentleman, gave a knowing smirk and adjusted his suit as if anticipating something interesting. Yet, the insulted passenger remained calm. He sat there, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. Not once did he look toward the flight attendant. He didn't demand an apology, didn't complain. He just waited, as if he knew something no one else did. Minutes passed. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs switched off. The cabin crew moved about, preparing the meal service. The arrogant flight attendant, still lost in her sense of superiority, continued treating the important passengers with exaggerated politeness. Then, a soft ping sounded through the cabin. The lead flight attendant, a senior member of the crew, emerged from the galley holding a small device in her hand. She scanned the cabin, her eyes searching, until they landed on him. And then she froze. Her eyes flickered with recognition, and her breath hitched. The crew near her noticed her reaction. One of them leaned in and whispered, "Is that really?" The lead attendant didn't respond. Instead, she straightened her uniform and rushed toward the cockpit. Passengers began to take notice. Small murmurs spread. Something was happening. The arrogant flight attendant remained oblivious, still serving drinks, still enjoying the power she thought she held. But then, another strange thing happened. A flight officer stepped out of the cockpit and approached the insulted passenger. He bowed slightly. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But those who saw it understood immediately. The atmosphere in first class had completely shifted. The other attendants were no longer relaxed. Their movements became precise, almost rehearsed. A quiet tension filled the space. And finally, the arrogant flight attendant noticed. She turned, her brows furrowing as she tried to understand why everyone had suddenly changed their behavior. Her confusion deepened when she noticed her fellow crew members stealing nervous glances at the man she had insulted. Then, she saw the lead flight attendant rush back from the cockpit. Her face was pale. And she was heading straight toward her. The lead flight attendant moved swiftly, her face a mix of urgency and regret. She reached the arrogant flight attendant and grabbed her by the wrist, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp like a knife. "What did you do?" The younger flight attendant blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The lead attendant's eyes darted toward the insulted passenger, who still sat calmly in his seat, watching everything unfold with quiet amusement. "You didn't," the lead attendant whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Passengers were watching now, sensing the tension. The businessmen, who had been soaking up the arrogant flight attendant's attention just moments ago, were now looking between her and the insulted passenger, trying to figure out what was happening. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We would like to extend a special welcome to one of our most distinguished passengers today. It is truly an honor to have you aboard." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened. The arrogant flight attendant stiffened. The man she had insulted shifted slightly in his seat, offering the lead flight attendant a small nod. She immediately bowed her head in response, something that made the rest of the cabin crew suck in a breath. The arrogant flight attendant suddenly felt ice cold. This couldn't be happening. She turned her head slowly toward the man she had dismissed so easily, her heartbeat thudding against her ribs. Who was he? Then, the whispers reached her. Passengers who had recognized him began speaking in hushed voices. One even pulled out his phone and subtly took a picture, his hands trembling slightly. And then, she heard the name. A name that sent a shiver down her spine. A name that should never be disrespected. She staggered back a step, her mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. The lead flight attendant took a slow breath before turning to face the insulted passenger properly. Her voice, though calm, carried weight. "Sir, on behalf of our entire crew, I offer our deepest apologies for any mistreatment you have faced today." The man simply raised a hand, silencing her. "No need," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. "But I do believe a lesson is about to be learned." The flight attendant felt her stomach drop. A lesson? Her throat tightened as she realized, her fate was no longer in her hands. The cabin was silent. Every passenger, every crew member, even the businessmen who had enjoyed the arrogant flight attendant's attention, all of them were watching. The insulted man leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding an apology. He wasn't making a scene. And yet, his mere presence was enough to send chills through the flight crew. The pilot stepped out of the cockpit. The moment the crew saw him, they snapped to attention. Even the lead flight attendant straightened her posture, her hands clasped in front of her. The arrogant flight attendant, still standing frozen in shock, felt something she had never felt before in her career: fear. The pilot didn't even look at her. Instead, he walked straight toward the insulted man and bowed. Not just a polite nod. A full, respectful bow. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers whispered to each other, their voices full of shock and curiosity. The arrogant flight attendant's mind raced. Who was this man? How could someone, who looked so ordinary, command this level of respect from the pilot himself? The insulted man finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "I don't enjoy unnecessary attention," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But when someone fails to recognize the value of respect, sometimes the lesson must be public." His words hit like a hammer. The arrogant flight attendant felt her knees weaken. The lead flight attendant took a cautious step forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, shall we move this discussion to a more private?" "No," the man interrupted smoothly. "She insulted me in front of an audience. Let the lesson be learned the same way." The arrogant flight attendant couldn't breathe. Passengers were staring at her now. Some with disapproval, others with curiosity. A few had even begun recording discreetly, sensing that something big was unfolding. The businessman in the next row whispered the man's name to a colleague. This time, the arrogant flight attendant heard it clearly. Her heart stopped. No. It couldn't be. She looked at him again, really looked. The calm posture. The refined air. The way the entire flight crew seemed terrified of disappointing him. She had insulted a man who could destroy her entire career with a single word. Her throat went dry. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what regret felt like. And the worst part? The lesson wasn't over yet. The arrogant flight attendant stood frozen, her mind racing. Her hands, which had once confidently served only the worthy passengers, now trembled at her sides. The insulted man, no, the powerful man, remained seated, watching her with an expression that wasn't cruel, wasn't angry, but was dangerous in its calmness. The pilot took a step forward, his jaw tight. "Sir, if there is anything we can do to," the man raised a hand, and the pilot fell silent immediately. Passengers held their breath. The flight crew stood stiffly, waiting. Then, he spoke. "I don't believe in punishment." The arrogant flight attendant almost sighed in relief. "But I do believe in teaching." Her relief vanished. The man's gaze shifted to the lead flight attendant. "Bring me the employee handbook." Without hesitation, she ran to retrieve it. The arrogant flight attendant felt her stomach drop. This was worse than punishment. This was humiliation. The other passengers were fully engaged now. Some leaned forward in their seats. Some whispered, some recorded, but all were watching. The lead flight attendant returned, handing him the thick booklet with shaking hands. He flipped through it casually. "Here," he said, tapping a page and turning it toward the lead attendant. "Read it out loud." Her eyes skimmed the words before her throat tightened. "Sir, perhaps we can read it." She swallowed hard and obeyed. All passengers, regardless of appearance or background, must be treated with equal respect and professionalism. Failure to uphold this standard will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Silence. The arrogant flight attendant felt her entire world closing in. Her career, her reputation, all of it balanced on this moment. She opened her mouth, desperate to explain, to justify, to beg. But no words came. Because there was no excuse. The man closed the handbook with a soft thud that somehow felt like the final nail in her coffin. And then he looked directly at her. "This flight is long," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "You now have two options." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "One," he continued, "you can be removed from your duties right now and face the consequences when we land." A chill ran down her spine. She knew what that meant. Public termination. A ruined career. No airline would hire her again. "Or two," he said, "you can prove that you actually understand the lesson, by personally serving every passenger on this flight with the respect they deserve." Her breath caught. A second chance? But, serving the very people she once looked down on? Humbling herself in front of everyone? She clenched her fists. She wanted to refuse. Wanted to argue. Wanted to hold on to the pride that had built her false sense of superiority. But as she looked at his expression, at the quiet power he held, she knew. She had no choice. Her pride wouldn't save her now. With a deep, shaky breath, she nodded. "I'll serve." Passengers whispered again, some shaking their heads, others smirking. The man gave a slow nod. "Good," he said. "Then your lesson begins." And with that, the ultimate regret set in. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't just serving drinks. She was learning respect. The flight attendant's hands trembled as she adjusted her uniform. This couldn't be real. Just hours ago, she had been untouchable, walking through the first-class cabin as if she owned it. Now, she was standing before the very passengers she had ignored, dismissed, or insulted, forced to serve them with humility. She swallowed her pride and took the first step. The lead flight attendant handed her a tray with a water bottle and a glass. The same simple request she had denied earlier. She turned toward the powerful man, the one she had treated like nothing, her heart pounding. She bent slightly and placed the glass before him. "Yes, sir, your water," she murmured, barely able to look him in the eye. He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he studied her. The moment stretched uncomfortably. It wasn't anger in his eyes, nor amusement. It was expectation. She realized with a sinking feeling, this wasn't enough. He wasn't looking for a forced, whispered apology. He was waiting for real humility. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." The words felt heavy, like dragging chains across her pride. A beat of silence. Then, he nodded. Just once. She exhaled, her shoulders slumping. But her lesson wasn't over yet. The lead flight attendant cleared her throat. "Continue serving, please," she said, motioning toward the other passengers. A deep, humiliating dread filled the arrogant flight attendant's chest. She turned, forcing herself to smile at the businessman she had showered with attention earlier. "Sir, would you like anything?" He smirked, clearly enjoying the shift in power. "Oh. You're actually asking now?" Heat rushed to her face, but she kept her composure. "Yes, sir." He let her wait, dragging the silence out, before finally asking for tea. She hurried off to prepare it, her hands stiff, her pride still burning. As she moved through the cabin, serving each passenger properly for the first time, the humiliation deepened. Some people watched with amusement, others with curiosity. Some whispered about her, but she couldn't react. Because she had no right to. And then, just as she thought things couldn't get worse, she reached economy class. Passengers who had witnessed everything now stared at her as she stepped in, holding a tray of drinks. A murmur spread. Some of them had seen her arrogance before. Some had suffered from it. Now, she was forced to serve them. And for the first time, she realized, this was true humiliation. This wasn't just a lesson in customer service. This was a lesson in respect. A lesson she would never forget. As she moved through the economy section, the flight attendant could feel the weight of every gaze on her. Passengers who had once been invisible to her were now watching, some with curiosity, some with quiet satisfaction. She had spent years looking down on them, believing they were beneath her attention. Now, she was forced to serve them. Her hands shook as she poured a cup of tea for an elderly man sitting by the window. She avoided his eyes, placing the cup gently on his tray. "Here you go, sir." But the man didn't take the cup. Instead, he smiled. "Look at me, child." She hesitated before forcing herself to meet his gaze. There was no mockery in his expression, no amusement at her downfall. Just understanding. "You're learning something important today, aren't you?" he asked, his voice kind. Her throat tightened. She couldn't answer. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You remind me of my granddaughter. Stubborn, proud, but good at heart." Her chest ached at his words. She wanted to believe she was good at heart. But was she? She had spent years treating people unequally, judging them by their wealth, their clothes, their looks. And now, she had been forced to see herself from the outside. She nodded stiffly, then moved on, eager to finish this humiliation. But the unexpected twist was waiting for her. As she stepped back into first class, the lead flight attendant approached her with a firm expression. "It's time," she said. She swallowed. Time for what? She turned toward the powerful man, the man she had insulted. He had finished his water, his face unreadable. And then, he stood up. Passengers whispered. Some gasped. The flight attendant's heart slammed against her ribs. Why was he standing? He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A business card. Without a word, he extended it toward her. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling. Her eyes scanned the card. And what she saw changed everything. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands shook as she stared at the words printed neatly in gold lettering. Because the man she had insulted, the man she had dismissed as unimportant, owned the airline. The flight attendant's hands trembled as she held the business card. The name printed in bold letters confirmed her worst fear. The man she had insulted owned the airline. Her breath hitched. A chill ran down her spine. Passengers gasped as whispers filled the cabin. Some already knew, some had only suspected, but now there was no doubt. The arrogant flight attendant's entire body felt numb. She had mocked, insulted, and dismissed the most powerful person on this flight. A man who could end her career with a single word. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to stand. She looked up at him, hoping, praying, for some kind of mercy. But his expression remained unreadable. The lead flight attendant cleared her throat, shifting nervously. "Sir, would you like us to arrange a report?" A report. The word made her stomach churn. If a report was filed, it was over. Airlines had no tolerance for employees who disrespected important passengers, especially not the owner of the airline. She would be fired before the plane even landed. The powerful man took a slow breath, still watching her. Then, in a voice calm and commanding, he spoke. "No report." Gasps rippled through the cabin. She blinked, her mind struggling to process what she just heard. No report? Hope sparked in her chest. Was this mercy? But then he continued. "No report, on one condition." Her heart stopped. She braced herself as he stepped forward. "You will complete this flight as usual," he said. "But when we land, you will make a choice." She swallowed hard. "A choice?" He nodded. "You can either walk away from this job forever," a shiver ran down her spine. Or, she held her breath. "You can request to be retrained, properly." Her head snapped up. "Retrained?" He continued, his tone still unreadable. "You have been given authority over passengers for years, but you never understood the responsibility that comes with it." She felt her throat tighten. He wasn't just giving her a way out. He was giving her a lesson. A deep, painful, humbling lesson. Her entire future depended on what she chose. And for the first time in her life, she had no power. No status. No control. Just a decision. Her mind raced. Passengers waited in silence. Some looked on with curiosity, others with admiration for the powerful man's wisdom. But all eyes were on her. Would she hold on to her pride? Or would she change? The answer would define her forever. The cabin was silent. Every passenger, every crew member, even the powerful man himself, all were waiting. The arrogant flight attendant gripped the business card tightly, her mind racing. Walk away from this job forever, or be retrained. The choice seemed simple. But it wasn't. If she quit, she could leave this humiliation behind. No more whispers, no more judgment. She could find another job, maybe at a smaller airline, maybe in a different industry. But deep inside, she knew. The problem wasn't the job. The problem was her. For years, she had looked down on others. She had used her position as a way to feel superior. And now, for the first time, she had to ask herself a question she had never considered before. Was she willing to change? Her throat tightened. She had spent her career believing that power came from status, from knowing the right people, from treating the rich with respect while dismissing those she saw as beneath her. But this man, the most powerful person on the plane, had taught her otherwise. True power wasn't about status. It was about respect. Respect given to everyone. The flight attendant took a slow breath, looking around. She saw the faces of passengers she had ignored. The businessmen who had once laughed at her jokes now looked at her with pity. And the man she had insulted, the man who could have ruined her life, had given her a choice. A real choice. She swallowed her pride, stepped forward, and spoke the hardest words she had ever said in her life. I want to change, she whispered. The powerful man studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then prove it. The words settled heavily in her chest. Prove it. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't a free pass. This was a second chance, but one she had to earn. The lead flight attendant stepped forward. We will arrange your retraining as soon as we land. The arrogant flight attendant nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. For the first time in years, she wasn't just serving passengers. She was learning. And as the flight continued, something inside her shifted. No longer just a flight attendant, no longer just someone in a uniform. She was finally someone ready to listen. And that was the lesson she would never forget. Respect is not about power. It is about how you treat people, no matter who they are.